Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about English law. I am not a barrister or solicitor. I'm a dilettante when it comes to law. I hope this series will be of use to the general viewer or anybody who's a beginner, those who are contemplating beginning a law degree, because it's very heavy weather and these legal texts are sometimes turgid. So it's good to give oneself a taster and decide, is this something that scintillates me? Would I be motivated to complete the degree? Because there's a high failure and dropout rate in law. So you might decide that law is enthralling and then you want to do a law degree. You might decide it's not for you. But in either case, it'd be useful to view some of this. This video is about European law. So that's a core subject for any law degree in England and Wales. And a law degree would typically be about 12 subjects. This is one of the compulsory ones. So laws emanating from the EU are partly made by the United Kingdom, because of course the United Kingdom is a member state for the moment. So these EU laws are part of the United Kingdom law, more broadly and specifically English law. Thing is, England has over 80% of the UK population, so many people think English and UK law are almost coterminous. Anyway, all these European laws will remain part of UK law after the United Kingdom departs the European Union, unless Parliament specifically repeals them. The default setting is that they stay, because to throw out them all would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and that would be to undo so much law since 1973. When the United Kingdom joined, of course, it was the European Economic Community, which has later evolved into the European Union. So mainland European countries follow Roman law, whereas the United Kingdom has its own common law. Well, Scotland's more Roman law. But Roman law has increasingly come into EU law over the decades. And the United Kingdom joined the EU on New Year's Day 1973, and there was a judge, his name escapes me, who said that European law is coming in up our estuaries like a tide, up our rivers, up our streams. So European law might be a fantastic thing, but there's no question it was going to significantly change English law, despite the fact that many Europhiles, like the Prime Minister at the time, Edward Heath, a Conservative, tried to allay some people's anxieties and say, oh no, there'll be virtually no change. So the notion of uniting Europe has been around since Roman times, and the Romans united much of Europe by force of arms, Pax Romana. And down the centuries, some European countries have united, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes by force. After the First World War, some people thought, well, why don't we sink our differences, just cooperate, just merge, and then there may be no more bloodshed. There was the idea of, say, Esperanto, that language, because, say, why do we have wars? We have wars because we have nations. Why do we have nations? Because we have languages. All right, we can't impose one language on others because that would be dominating them. Let's come up with a neutral language, a mélange of existing European languages with simple grammar, and that's how a Belarusian doctor invented Esperanto, but it didn't work. So after the Second World War, there was a renewed impetus to unite countries, certainly in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, that was the Eastern Bloc. These were communist countries dominated by the Soviet Union. So some people strove for European unity and sought to foster peace and prosperity. The continent had been shattered by two devastating wars. So the Soviet Union, that's based on Russia, had troops in many Central European countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and so forth. Civil liberties and human rights were circumscribed in these countries quite seriously. So a communist government was introduced, and people were not rich. Anyway, private property and religious liberty were largely done away with. Western European countries did not want to go the same way, though they had significant communist parties. So some Western European politicians noted that poverty and unemployment drove people to despair, fury, and support for totalitarian regimes. They say if democracy is only going to lead to failure and suffering, well, we might as well have a totalitarian government, the smack-of-firm government that made people prey to fascism or another totalitarian ideology. So these Western European politicians said, we must keep unemployment down, we must abolish penury, we must promote democracy, and we must kindle amity between the peoples of Eastern Europe. And they formed the European Coal and Steel Community. because coal was a vital fuel then. Oil was fairly important. Obviously, oil is far more important. We don't use coal very much now, because coal was used for transport. There was still, coal-fired trains in the 50s, and domestic heating as well. A lot of people didn't have radiators. So coal and steel were crucial for war. But if these resources were shared between France and Germany, then there wouldn't be a war again. These countries, that was the fault line of Europe. 3 major European wars have been fought there in the space of only 70 years. So the British Prime Minister in the early 1950s was an outspoken advocate for this policy. He was someone you may have heard of, Sir Winston Churchill. However, he contended that this was for mainland Europe, not the United Kingdom. Remember, the British Empire existed back then, and some people, like Churchill, believed it had a long-term future and wouldn't be dissolved for decades. So he urged these continental countries to cooperate, but said the United Kingdom would stand aloof, would wish them well from a distance. And these countries must form the United States of Europe. As Churchill said, we are with Europe, but not of it. He looked to the empire, which was then renaming itself the Commonwealth. And he still harboured this fond delusion that the United Kingdom was a superpower. Those Suez in 1956 was to put paid to that myth. He also thought the United Kingdom had unique ties with the United States. That was the Atlantic Alliance. So the UK should not join in European integration, otherwise that would enfeeble the UK's cordial relationship with the United States. That was Churchill's viewpoint. Many Conservatives agreed with him. Now, not everybody in Western Europe liked the European project. Robert Schuman, one of the fathers of Europe, he realised they had to go slow. It had to be step by step. You mustn't frighten the horses. You mustn't rush in. This new European project must appear to act through the member states themselves, because people were very attached to their national identities. They didn't want that sublimated in a wider European identity. He thought we must lead by an elite consensus, do it gradually such that people don't notice. Some people felt their national identity would be degraded. Many people were embittered towards their neighbouring nations owing to their ghastly wartime experiences. So there was a very widespread detestation of Germany in other European countries. Germany's name was mud because the German military had carried out countless large-scale atrocities in the countries which had been under their jackboot. Some people disliked the notion of French domination. Remember, France was the largest country in Western Europe at the time in both area and population. Germany was divided. Remember, there was West Germany. That's about 3/4 of modern Germany, which was the democratic capitalist one. There was East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and that was the communist one. The Treaty of Rome. Well, the European Coal and Steel Community led to the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The preamble called for the ever closer union of the peoples of Europe. Now, Europhiles often said, well, you signed the Treaty of Rome, you know it's ever closer union, that's it, complete. We must have a unitary state eventually, or a federal Europe. But Eurosceptics will say, well, we could sign up to that, but it was a closer union of the peoples, not of the states. But perhaps that's just semantics. Anyway, all countries who joined the EU subsequently signed this. So how was Europe to be integrated? Well, those who favoured this European project of integration decided to tread cautiously. They had to be circumspect lest they provoke too much opposition, preparing the public mind for deeper integration. And they had to be discreet about their long-term goals, because if their ultimate objective was known, then many people would resist it. Furthermore, they chose to act through national institutions insofar as possible. The European community would eventually have to downgrade the autonomy allowed to the nation states. So step by step, these EU institutions were to accrue greater power. So the European Economic Community later turned into the European Community, later turned into the European Union. Who knows what next? So it was built up piecemeal. It wasn't overnight. So until the foundation of the EEC, many of these EE states had tariff barriers against each other. So if Belgian goods were being imported into France, they'd be taxed by the French. French goods were being imported into Belgium, they'd be taxed by the Belgians and so on. These were protective tariffs to make foreign products more expensive, to encourage people to buy domestic products. So there were regulations in Italy for goods that you wanted to sell there, and they'd be different from the regulations in Germany, making it tricky to export goods or indeed services to other countries. It was costlier to hire services from elsewhere, also for tax reasons. It may have been illegal for a German company to have an accountant in the Netherlands and vice versa because their way of doing things were not legal in the other jurisdiction. There was no mutual recognition of qualifications. Dentists in Luxembourg could not perform dentistry in Italy, even though human teeth are the same everywhere. A Dutch architect wouldn't be allowed to practice architecture in France, for instance. So the EEC required that countries scrap tariff barriers against each other. They could keep tariff barriers against non-EEC states. So they moved to common standards and rules for goods and services. Mutual recognition of qualifications was gradually introduced. And this is a tricky thing because the educational systems were not parallel. France doesn't really have a bachelor's degree. It's got a licence, which is maybe something lower. And then in Germany, they didn't have bachelor's degrees at all. They only had we call it magister or magistrat, I can't remember, like a master's degree, 5 years at least. And you couldn't do a bachelor's degree until quite recently. So it was they weren't quite on a par. So the UK expressed an interest in joining the EEC in the early 60s. Under Harold Macmillan, President of France, de Gaulle said no to the United Kingdom. He believed that the United Kingdom would not commit to the European Union and it was too pro-American. He'd had a bit of falling out with the United States. He ordered the American troops to leave France. Kennedy said, does that include the ones in the cemeteries? So many American soldiers had died defending France. But anyway, perhaps he was prescient, de Gaulle, because we see the UK leaving the European Union now. Of course, you couldn't know that about 1961. The British Empire was being dissolved. By the early 60s, people had faced facts. The British Empire had no future. And Macmillan said, let's just be rich. It actually costs us more to run than we get from it. So these colonies became independent. The Commonwealth was formed. And that was for former colonies which wished to be members of the Commonwealth. Some people in the United Kingdom still felt that the Commonwealth really mattered and was more important than the European Union. So the EEC, I should say, had a much larger population. However, many Commonwealth countries had a very low per capita income, so couldn't afford many British products. So the late 60s, there was a Labour government in the United Kingdom. Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, and he applied to join the EEC. Once again, the UK was rebuffed. So the Liberal Party, it was a tiny part of the UK since the 50s, had been very for the European Union. Some Liberals said, we're not to the left or to the right of the other parties. They reject the whole left-right analysis. They often said we are ahead of the other parties. And in a sense, they were right, because this is the progressive view, and actually the two major parties largely came on board. However, there were significant Eurosceptic wings in both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Then in the early 70s, there was a Conservative government in the United Kingdom, led by Edward Heath. And Heath had been a day one believer in European integration. Right in the Second World War, said, we've got to join this. We don't want to fight again. And we must have peace and cooperation, and that will enrich all of us in the financial sense and every other. So by that stage, most of the Conservative Party was pro-EEC. The EEC was usually called the common market in the United Kingdom, as in, you share the market. You can sell all your things in this market. You can buy everything you need from that market. Whereas previously, it was tricky to trade across borders. A minority of Labour MPs were pro-EEC by that. Way back in the 50s when it had been talked about, I can't remember which Labour MP said it was, that the Durham miners won't wear it. That being Cockney, as in London working class slang. The miners in Northern England will not accept it. That's what that means in proper English. The UK economy was stagnant by the early 70s. France was experiencing an economic boom, so was West Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, and it seemed that the EEC was the way forward. These countries were prospering more so than the UK. So the United Kingdom appeared to be in decline. The country was plagued by strikes. The economy was being palsied by them. So the Heath asked civil servants if joining the EEC would entail major changes to the United Kingdom's law. And then Heath released a statement saying there would be no loss of essential national sovereignty. Now, the operative word there is essential. How much is essential? He published this despite the civil servants have advising him that that's actually not the case. It will involve a very significant loss of national sovereignty. Now, some people prefer to say pooled. We share it. You can have some of ours, we'll have some of yours. The United Kingdom has some say in the affairs of Italy. Italy has say in the affairs of the Netherlands. Luxembourg has say in the affairs of West Germany, and blah, blah, blah. We're all cooperating, we're all sharing, we're all doing this together. So Lord Denning, that was the renowned judge who said that European law would be like an incoming tide. It would influence and shape all areas of British law. So I do mean British, not just English, because obviously for Northern Ireland, Scotland as well. So Lord Denning was not saying that European law was either desirable or undesirable, simply it would seriously change UK law. So be under no illusions about that. It was churlish of Heath to lie to the public about this. So Heath assured people there would never be a single European currency, although some Europhiles had talked about it in the 60s. He said this was scaremongering. So anyway, then 1st of January 1973, the UK joined the same day as we in the Republic of Ireland joined, and indeed Denmark acceded to the EEC.